The Bogosity Podcast, early and ad-free. Become a subscriber at Patreon, Subscribestar, or Discord. Use the links at donate.bogosity.tv.
Welcome to the Bogosity Podcast for the week of July 28, 2024, the podcast that illegally crosses time zones. This is your host, Shane Killian. Let's solemnify the news of the bogus. Let's ease ourselves into this week with some good news in scattered places where people who run businesses from their homes are now facing less bullying from regulators. Starting in the pandemic, there was a surge in new home-based startups for small and individually owned businesses. That continued even as the pandemic ended and more people went back to work. Now, more people are running businesses from their homes than ever before. But all over the country, local regulations make it difficult for them. Whether in zoning laws or regulations designed to protect the public, many people who feel that they have done absolutely nothing wrong have often had that dreaded visit from someone from the government saying how dare they use their property in a way they want to. Fortunately, some places are beginning to reform these regulations. For example, Bismarck, North Dakota revised their zoning ordinance, which had previously prohibited all general, commercial, and industrial uses, to merely restrictions that, quote, protect the quiet enjoyment of residential property and discourage all uses or activities that interfere with or detract from these principal uses of this zoning district. It creates 3 tiers of home businesses: minor ones which have limited to no impact, which no longer require permits; major ones that have a small to moderate impact, which now require special use permits only in urban zones; and the highest tier, which requires a special use permit in all cases. It's head-shakingly dumb, I know, but it was better than the blanket prohibition they had before. The state of New Jersey also overwhelmingly passed an act which allowed home businesses to be permitted accessory uses. More and more states and localities are following suit. Last October, 3.5 years after the start of the pandemic, applications for new home businesses are still 59% greater than they were before the pandemic began. That reverses a decades-long slide up to that point. It's not just that people got bit by the entrepreneurship bug, but the bad economy since Biden took over has caused side hustles to become a necessity for more and more Americans. According to the Small Business Administration, 50% of all businesses are launched out of people's homes. That's impressive considering that, for most industries in most places, they have far more oppressive rules they have to overcome. Cottage food industries, for example, easily run afoul of rules that even established restaurants and caterers would find overly burdensome, and, by the way, don't have to follow. That's why Arizona Governor Katie Hobbs signed a cottage food deregulation bill after having previously vetoed it, because Democrats were joining with Republicans to threaten an override. Of course, even after all that, there's still the bogus part, which is, why do we have to do this at all? What right does government have to tell us we can't run businesses out of our own homes? I mean, do we own our own property or not? If you're looking for a way to support this channel, but you don't have any spare cash and you can't stand ads, you can do so by generating your own cryptocurrency. Use the links at the bottom of the description to follow the link to Odysee.com to listen to the podcast and see all of my YouTube videos as well. Just watching videos will produce cryptocurrency for the creator and yourself. And since Odysee is always monetized and never censored, you'll have no problem seeing all the videos from your favorite creators. You can also use the library credits you create at Odysee to tip creators and even purchase paid content. Earn library credits through various rewards, including daily view rewards and the number of shares and invites. And you can interact with creators in all sorts of ways, including like and dislike, comment, boost a post by supporting it, repost it, and share to other sites, all while earning crypto for the creator. Easily monetize yourself and your favorite creators using cryptocurrency, without advertising. Use the link below to visit this channel on Odysee.com and see many of your other favorites there as well. Okay, another bit of good news as our country moves an inch closer towards actual justice, or Michigan at least. The Michigan Supreme Court has said it's not a crime to run from the cops if they had no legitimate reason to stop you to begin with. A Kalamazoo man, Douglas Prude, was convicted of fleeing from police and assaulting, resisting, or obstructing a police officer. He had been sitting alone in his car with the engine off in a parking lot getting ready to visit his girlfriend in an area regularly patrolled by police because of frequent reports of criminal activity. An officer asked Prude for his ID and whether he lived there. He didn't give his name, but one of the officers already knew his identity. He started his car and drove away. Police caught him, charged him, and he had been convicted by a jury in Kalamazoo County. The conviction was upheld by the Michigan Court of Appeals. But the state Supreme Court ruled 5-2 that the officers never had any sufficient reason to suspect Prude of any crime and their attempts to detain him weren't legal. Quote, "There is nothing suspicious about a citizen sitting in a parked car in an apartment complex parking lot while visiting a resident of that complex. Moreover, a citizen's mere presence in an area of frequent criminal activity does not provide particularized suspicion that they were engaged in any criminal activity, and an officer may not detain a citizen simply because they decline a request to identify themselves." The court ruled that simply being in a high-crime area wasn't a reasonable basis to suspect someone of a crime, and neither was being alone in a legally parked car. Quote, "Accordingly, because the officers did not act lawfully when they detained defendant, a required element of the offenses, there was insufficient evidence to support his convictions beyond a reasonable doubt." It'd be nice if more judges across the country held that opinion. Unfortunately, more of them seem to be in line with the two dissenters who wrote, "Viewing all the facts of the case in the light most favorable to the prosecution, the lower courts did not clearly err by finding that the officers had a reasonable suspicion the defendant was trespassing." But you're not supposed to view the facts in the light most favorable to the prosecution. The defendant enjoys the benefit of any doubt. And they said that merely being there and refusing to identify himself means they had reasonable suspicion to suspect him of a crime. It never made any sense to me that you could arrest someone for obstruction or resisting arrest when there was nothing to obstruct and no arrest to resist. Sadly, even when there's nothing, the cops still usually win out. Really, Prude was arrested for not respecting their authority, which is something that should always be instantly thrown out of any court and ideally the officers punished. But even when it's thrown out, as in this case, they never are. They have no incentive to learn their lesson. They have no reason not to try it again next time. Just look at states where marijuana is legal, where cops arrest people for it anyway. They're let go, but nothing ever happens to the cops. Same with the amount of times cops arrest someone for filming them. So this is a good development, and hopefully more states follow suit, but there still need to be serious steps taken toward police accountability. If you're on the Wi-Fi in a coffee shop or hotel, anyone on that network can get your traffic. Do you really trust all of those strangers? For that matter, do you really trust your ISP? A VPN can protect you from prying eyes, disguise your location, and even foil government censors. It's essential in this day and age, so go to vpn.pagosity.tv and you'll be taken to BoxPN. Starting at just $2.99 a month, you can get unlimited high-speed connections to VPN servers all over the world, and they don't log connections, so your privacy is assured. Traveling abroad, just VPN home, and don't worry about what those other governments are doing. Back at home, stop your ISP from traffic shaping and messing with the quality internet access you're paying good money for. You can connect from multiple machines at once, including your smartphone or tablet, and it supports all the secure standards, including OpenVPN and SSTP. Bypass censors and surveillance with your own secure VPN connection. Go to vpn.pagosity.tv. So yeah, a lot of us are kinda skeptical of Kaspersky, what with them being based in Moscow and all. But the U.S. government has been pushing harder and harder to remove our choice in security software by instituting a ban on them in the U.S. It hasn't been getting as much attention as the TikTok ban, but it's a harder push, and it's been going on for much longer. The fear, of course, is that Kaspersky could be compromised by Kremlin spies, and this would give them access to huge swaths of information on the computers of every single system that runs it. But the only thing security software needs to prove itself is sunlight. So in 2017, Kaspersky proposed what they called a comprehensive assessment framework so that third parties can verify the security of their products, software updates, and threat detection rules. This includes third-party review of Kaspersky's code, data collection, and communications. This should convince the U.S. government, or anyone else, that Kaspersky would be safe, that they could safely choose the software, and there would be no reason to ban it. But so far, the federal government has ignored the proposals and declined to answer comments from the press. The company said, quote, "These are, in fact, the mitigation measures we've submitted in a proposal for discussion to the U.S. Department of Commerce, once again confirming our openness to dialogue and determination to provide the ultimate level of security assurances. However, our proposal was simply ignored." Yulia Shlakova, Kaspersky's VP of Public Affairs, said, quote, "We do see trends of digital protectionism. We do see trends of made-in software, which is not necessarily best because not all countries have good domestic antivirus. Therefore, we continue to advocate for a technical-based, evidence-based approach to evaluate trustworthiness, and we have been sharing these principles, this framework, with different regulators. The framework includes localizing data processing in the U.S. and setting a strict cybersecurity policy preventing it from being accessed from other countries. Kaspersky already has such a system in place in Saudi Arabia and Brazil. That will be substantiated by review by a third party approved by regulators. But it doesn't look like any of it will bear fruit in the U.S., considering that the Department of Commerce banned contracts with Kaspersky on the 20th, and if nothing changes, Kaspersky will be prohibited from providing software, including antivirus updates, to U.S. consumers and businesses on September 30. Regardless of whatever you might think about how trustworthy Kaspersky may or may not be, that's a decision each person should be allowed to make for themselves. This is not consumer protection. It's protectionism, plain and simple. But hey, at least they're making sure we can only use safe software service solutions like CrowdStrike. Do you have children, or nieces or nephews? Are you homeschooling, or just want to counter some of the socialist indoctrination most children get in school? If so, go to bogosity.tv/TuttleTwins, and you'll be taken to a website where you can get some great books for elementary-aged children. The Tuttle Twins books are books about liberty and free market economics that include children's versions of Bastiat's The Law, Leonard Read's I, Pencil, and Hayek's The Road to Serfdom, as well as books about the Federal Reserve and how regulations protect business cronies. They'll learn about the harm caused by eminent domain, or regulations passed in the name of safety, and fundamental concepts of liberty. And as you can see from the sample pages on the website, they're all easy to read and nicely illustrated. They're just $9.99 a piece, or get a special discount as well as free bonuses when you purchase all 5. You can even buy in bulk to donate to schools and local libraries. So get the Tuttle Twins books at bogosity.tv/TuttleTwins. And now it's time to bureaucratize this week's biggest bogon emitter. So you know CAPTCHAs, right? Those are those little pop quizzes you have to pass when logging into some websites so they can tell you're a human and not a computer. The thing is, in these days of AI, they've really become more of a nuisance than anything that protects us from bots. And even worse than that, according to a group of researchers from the University of California, Irvine, it's actually harvesting information from users while taking advantage of human labor worth billions. It started off simple enough. It showed you letters and numbers in a screwed up font that a computer couldn't OCR. Pass it, and you must be human. reCAPTCHA, before it was acquired by Google, decided to use this for a good cause, scanning public domain books in digital format for Project Gutenberg. A user was shown 2 words, a good one and one the computer couldn't figure out. If the human solved the good one, then they knew what the other word was. A couple more times for verification, and the word was put into the digital book. Google acquired reCAPTCHA in 2009 and revised it into reCAPTCHA v2 in 2014 and reCAPTCHA v3 in 2018. It looks at behavioral clues such as mouse movements to determine if you're human, and if it can't figure it out, it shows you a grid of images and tells you to click on, say, all the fire hydrants. A lot of people have noticed that what it seems to be doing is using us as unpaid labor to help train the AI for its autonomous cars. And the researchers found it was even more sinister than that. According to lead author Andrew Searles, quote, "I believe reCAPTCHA's true purpose is to harvest user information and labor from websites. If you believe that reCAPTCHA is securing your website, you have been deceived. Additionally, this false sense of security has come with an immense cost of human time and privacy." So, first of all, it doesn't work anymore. Even back in 2016, reCAPTCHA v2 could be defeated 70% of the time, while the checkbox could be defeated 100% of the time. Version 3 is better, but reinforcement learning models from 2019 are capable of defeating its challenges 97% of the time. According to co-author Gene Sudik, it isn't even a true CAPTCHA. CAPTCHA stands for Completely Automated Public Turing Test to tell computers and humans apart. But V3 isn't a Turing test, and it isn't even public. Quote, "It is a behavioral analytics-based method that assigns scores to user behavior. Thus, it's privacy invasive since we, the public, don't know how it works. It's essentially a black box." According to Searles, quote, "These systems were beaten before they were ever introduced on the global scale. Image selection problems were solved by computers in 2009, yet added by Google in 2014. reCAPTCHA third-party cookies for behavioral detection introduced the click-checking vulnerability, making it easier to automatically bypass them. And it's basically giving Google free labor. The paper states, "In terms of cost, we estimate that, during over 13 years of its deployment, 819 million hours of human time has been spent on reCAPTCHA, which corresponds to at least $6.1 billion in wages. Traffic resulting from reCAPTCHA consumed 134 petabytes of bandwidth, which translates into about 7.5 million kilowatt hours of energy, corresponding to 7.5 million pounds of CO2. In addition, Google has potentially profited $888 billion from cookies and $8.75 to $32.3 billion per each sale of their total labeled data set." So ultimately, reCAPTCHA makes no sense from a security perspective, but makes complete sense if the goal is to collect data that Google can marketize. The paper concludes, "Ultimately, given these points, it can be concluded that reCAPTCHA v2 presents no real security, given that 1. reCAPTCHA v2 is negatively perceived by most users, 2. its immense cost, and 3. its susceptibility to bots. Our results prompt a natural conclusion. reCAPTCHA v2 and similar reCAPTCHA technology should be deprecated." Google claims that reCAPTCHA data isn't used for anything other than improving reCAPTCHA. Searles responded, quote, "Could they prove this with a public audit of all their records? While they may claim this to be the case now, this is not the claim of the white paper. The re in reCAPTCHA stands for reusing the data from CAPTCHAs to train ML models. Actually, that wasn't it originally. It was because the words solved by users were then reused as control words. It was only machine learning when Google got a hold of it." Searles continues, "Also, legally, this is a very vague statement. You could consider that selling reCAPTCHA user data to be an improvement of the service because you can take that money and reinvest it into reCAPTCHA and it would be considered an improvement. Note how they do not claim that they don't sell user data." Google claimed, "Further, a majority of our user base have moved to reCAPTCHA v3, which improves fraud detection with invisible scoring." Searles responded, "Trivially bypassed in 2019, reCAPTCHA v3 offers 0 provable claims surrounding its security. Invisible scoring, aka a black box, is a ridiculous claim and has nothing to do with Turing tests or CAPTCHAs. Just do a search for how to bypass reCAPTCHA v3 and you'll see how many solutions there are. There are even browser extensions that'll do it for you. Google also claimed, even if a site were still on the previous generation of the product, reCAPTCHA v2 visual challenge images are all pre-labeled and user input plays no role in image labeling. Searles responded, would they publicly release all data from all historic reCAPTCHA solutions to prove such a claim? Notably, they claim in 2014 that they had it based on a classic computer vision problem of image labeling, when this computer vision problem was solved in 2010 with 100% accuracy. Earlier in this blog, they claimed to be phasing out distorted text because of its ability to be solved by computers at 99% accuracy. There is either an extreme degree of incompetence or a massive contradiction. Let's replace defeated technology with more defeated technology because it's more secure. It's pretty obvious that they used it to train machine learning models since this is the purpose of reCAPTCHA. Of course, they still haven't explained why the new images of crosswalks or whatever show up so slowly. So all of that makes Google this week's biggest bogon emitter. I want to tell you about the eyeglasses I've been wearing for years. As people can see on my videos, I have a very strong prescription, which makes glasses more expensive, especially when I need computer glasses, reading glasses, prescription sunglasses, and most expensively, progressive lenses for general everyday wear. To save money while still getting quality glasses, I get them from Firmoo. In fact, I just got a pair of progressives with high-index aspherical lenses and a nice pair of frames my wife loves for just over $100. It would have been $500 to get them through my eye doctor. Not only do they look good, the glasses are durable. I've worn many pairs for several years without problems. All orders come with a 30-day return policy, a 3-month warranty, and one-on-one customer service. Go to Firmoo, that's FIRMOO.Bogosity.tv anytime you need quality glasses at a low price. Once again, that's Firmoo.Bogosity.tv. And now let's remonstrate this week's Idiot Extraordinaire. And this week it goes to Christopher Wray for outright lying about and Newsweek for insane conspiracy garbage regarding whether or not Trump was actually shot. Yes, they're still at it. So Congress, of course, is investigating the July 13 assassination attempt on Donald Trump, and they questioned Christopher Wray about it in Congress.
As I said, I think with respect to former President Trump, there's some question about whether or not it's a bullet or shrapnel that hit his ear. So it's conceivable. Although, as I sit here right now, I don't know whether that bullet, in addition to causing the grazing, could have also landed somewhere else. But I believe we've accounted for all of the shots in the cartridges.
Which is absolutely ridiculous. There's just no real room for doubt that Trump was hit in the ear by a bullet. Doubly ridiculous since it didn't even have anything to do with what he was asked. He was asked how many bullet cases were recovered from the roof and where the bullets went. We even have a picture of it, one of those 1 in a million snaps where a photographer, Doug Mills, caught the bullet in flight just after it went by. It was a really bright day, so he had his shutter speed set to S/8000. Now, the bullet left a streak about 5 inches long. That's the distance the bullet traveled during the time the camera's shutter was open. To go that distance in 1/8000th of a second, it was traveling a good 3,000 feet per second. It had to have been. That was not shrapnel. That was a bullet. Shrapnel does not travel over 2.5 times the speed of sound. But it's about right for the DPMS DR-15 that the shooter is reported to have used. We don't know for sure if it's the same bullet that hit him or one of the ones fired a moment later, but still, the picture is clear and unmistakable about what happened. The theory that it's glass from a shattered teleprompter is easily debunked by looking at the videos from after the shooting and noting that the teleprompters are intact. Even Snopes, never one to do Trump any favors, rated the claim false. They wrote, "In Snopes' view, neither the simple existence of shrapnel nor the lack of official confirmation from the FBI into an active investigation outweighs the balance of visual evidence demonstrating that Trump's wound stemmed from a bullet that grazed his ear." Trump's doctor, Ronnie Jackson, didn't mince any words.
This is absolutely ridiculous that he would make a comment like this. This degrades any level of credibility that this man may have had after years of weaponizing the FBI and the DOJ against the president. It was absolutely a bullet. I examined it. It was the track of a bullet. It was scooped out, just as it would be in the track of a bullet. It had the telltale other damage that is associated with it. All the surrounding tissue in the ear was swollen and edematous. His ear looked like, a wrestler's ear when it was fat and swollen. And that goes along with the trauma from a high-velocity bullet as it passes through tissue. That's a hallmark of a gunshot wound, is that the tissue outside around the bullet track is also traumatized and damaged. And that would not happen from a piece of glass or even from a fragment. That was a bullet. Everybody saw it. The whole world witnessed what happened. That's why this man's being butchered right now, because it was on live television. This is the organization that's tasked with the investigation of the assassination attempt. And it's irresponsible for this man to make these kind of comments as a sitting FBI director, because all he does is add fuel to the fire for the morons and the assassination deniers like Joy Reid and Keith Olbermann and other idiots like that are out there that don't want the public, or they're trying to minimize what happened to the president. He almost died, Larry. It's as close as you can come to get, as close as you can get to dying. So this was a big deal, and for them to try to minimize it just pisses me off, quite frankly.
Okay, so that gets us to Newsweek, who on the 25th posted an entire article attempting to substantiate the idea that Trump wasn't shot with a bullet. Choosing not even to believe Jackson, they led with a headline, "Donald Trump might not have been shot after all." It took them being flamed on the internet for over 4 hours before they changed it to, "Donald Trump may not have been hit by bullet," FBI director says. But even this new headline is beyond irresponsible for a news company. An interim headline, "Donald Trump may not have been hit by bullet," is what it read at the time I grabbed the link for this podcast. This is a kooky conspiracy theory, nothing more. I can forgive postings like this a day or two after the shooting as the fog of war, but 12 days later, with pictures and expert testimony all showing it was a bullet, clinging to this insane conspiracy theory is irresponsible, especially for a major news outlet. Especially when the Secret Service themselves have acknowledged that this is what's happened. And so the leftist crazies are going to be screeching that Trump faked it at least through Election Day, mark my words, with the news media giving them cover all the way. So all of that makes Christopher Wray in Newsweek this week's Idiot Extraordinaire. Well, that wraps up this "The Bigger the Disaster, the Better for Us" edition of the Bogosity Podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please go to donate.bogosity.tv for several ways to support, and discord.bogosity.tv to join the discussion. Subscribe at the Discord or at Patreon or Subscribestar, and you can listen early and ad-free. Thank you for listening. Until next time, here's a quote from Christopher Hitchens. "I learned that very often the most intolerant and narrow-minded people are the ones who congratulate themselves on their tolerance and open-mindedness." The Bogosity Podcast is licensed under Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 4.0 International License.
Bogosity.